Hello and welcome to another episode of the Magical World of G. Michael Vasey podcast. And in this episode, I'm talking to Nikolas Schreck. And we're going to look at his journey, his initiatory journey, through all kinds of wonderful and not so wonderful places, and the conclusions that he's come to. And I urge you to listen to the end. And if you don't have the patience to listen to the end, then please do skip a little bit towards the end, because I think that the things that Nikolas said towards the end of this podcast were fundamental truths, undeniable truths that everybody needs to listen to. I'd like to thank Nikolas for participating in my podcast, and I'd like to encourage you to listen to some of his music, which you can find down in the links below. I'll link to his music. Please do like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Helps me out a great deal. And the first question that I asked Nikolas was, what got you interested in magic in the first place? Here's Nikolas.
Well, the honest answer is I feel like as soon as I came into this physical vehicle, magic came to me. I didn't look for it. It came to me immediately. And I can tell you that some of my very first thoughts, as it really like once the verbal mechanism is going in your brain as a child, a very young child, I looked around at this world that we are in and thought, how did I get here? This is not the right place. And that, I would say, was the beginning of my initiation. And maybe for everybody, everyone has to come to that question at some point in their life. But for me, it came early, which immediately showed me that, well, you're not a blank slate. Obviously, I'm continuing a thought process that began elsewhere. So I never had any doubt about reincarnation. My first thought was looking around at this world, and I can remember it, and I feel like that even more now. Like, where the hell is this? What is this alien place? This is not my home. This isn't. It's like if you set out to go to one destination and you crash landed in some hinterland somewhere. That was my emotional feeling. So I was immediately, as a child, attracted to anything to do with magic, mythology, the gods. That all seemed familiar to me. The human world seemed alien and like, what the fuck are these creatures? But everything to do with the divine or the demonic or the supernatural or the trans or transhuman, whatever, that spoke to me. And the first thing that I can recall, one of my earliest memories, is my parents on their honeymoon in Paris got a statue of the Venus de Milo about that large, and it was on the lowest shelf of their bookshelf. And I used to sit in front of it entranced by this statue. I had no idea what it was. I had no concept of what it was, but it drew me and fascinated me. And eventually, when I could begin to speak properly, I asked my father, what is it? And he had come from a classical education when American universities still taught you anything. And so he knew Greek mythology, Roman mythology, all that. And he told me, and to his credit, he always spoke to me as an adult, so he explained what a goddess is, what Venus is, what Aphrodite is, her relationship to Mars, all of this, more than I could grasp at that age, but it made an impression. And I had an experience with this statue of Venus. I would say it is my first initiatory experience, where there was I would describe it like an orange globe of light came out of it when I was staring at it, and it seemed to enter me and created a warm energy, a feeling of welcoming, of benevolence, of I would say of grace, really. And so I became immediately fascinated with Greek mythology, first of all, obsessed with it. And the first book that I recall really reading, it was mostly a picture book, was a book called Daulaire's Illustrated History of Greek Mythology. And I studied that thing like I was studying to be a brain surgeon. I have to know, what is the relationship between Zeus and Hercules? What is exactly the connection between Eurydice and Orpheus? Like, I became completely immersed in that. And everything to do with Greek mythology was And of course, then that got me immediately into sorcery, magic, because, as you know, all of the Hellenic religious tradition is all about magic, magia, magia technica, as they would call it in Greece, the art and technique of magic. So I was immersed in it immediately, to the point where I ignored the quote real human world, and lived in my early couple of years in a world of Greek mythology, and then looked into other mythology. So that's the short answer to that question, actually.
And where did you end up when you were able to explore the interest in the magical? Did you go through school, some kind of a school, or did you get exposed to some individuals and their teachings? Which direction did it take you?
Yeah, I would say growing up in the 60s during the occult revival and magical revival in the United States, which I think for people of this generation who have grown up with the internet, as I came to age in the 1960s when I was a child, and then in the early 70s, uh, bookstores, films, the media was filled with magic. I mean, it was just, you couldn't escape from it. There was something otherworldly entered this planet during that period that is known as the 60s, for sure. And I think anyone who experienced it remembers that feeling. So, wherever you went, there was magic, sorcery. All these old grimoires were being reprinted. The works, to fulfill the market of this interest in occultism that was everywhere. All these old books were printed, and I read them voraciously, studied them. So it was, as a child, it was mostly self-taught, and I immediately began experimenting with it. 3 experiences that I can say really went from an interest to beginning to practice and really engage with the material in a pragmatic way. One thing, as we mentioned in our pre-talk, one of the guiding principles in my initiation has been the feminine.
Yeah.
And the goddess. And as I explained, my first contact with the divine was through Venus, Aphrodite. And so she has led me through everything. So my first real initiatrix, when I was a very young child, and I've described this before, I had a babysitter who was of Swedish stock, and she let me stay up very late at a time where I don't know what it was like in Britain, where you had different rules about horror movies with the X certificate. But in similar way, in those days, they showed horror movies only after midnight on TV, like to keep them away from kids.
Yeah.
And my babysitter, and this was in the mid 60s, already considered herself to be a witch. She identified herself as a witch. I have no idea of what tradition. And she was like a connoisseur and aficionado of the supernatural. And so we would watch the ancient Universal movies and some of the new, at that time, new Hammer films, as if she was teaching a seminar on the supernatural. And I took it deadly seriously. She would explain the lore of lycanthropy, of vampirism. The Mummy, the Boris Karloff one, had a huge influence and drew me into the mystique of ancient Egypt. And of course, all of these films show magic and supernatural activity, and that's what really drew me to them. I believe that in our secular atheist world, in some ways, supernatural fiction and horror for many people is like the only portal to the supernatural, to the religious, and that's the way. So she kind of was my guide, as I've explained before, into these things. And from that, I began looking into ancient Egypt. And definitely it's due to Boris Karloff's 1930s film, The Mummy. And then I looked into it more seriously. So she was kind of an early teacher, this witch babysitter. Then, and by that time, I was completely immersed in it. It's all I was thinking about was magic, reading books about magic, grimoires. I remember a book by Archon Darrell called Witches and Sorcerers that really lit a fire into looking into the lives and techniques of ancient masters and magicians and that kind of thing. Then in 1972, my father had a connection which is still murky to me and probably seemed kind of shady in retrospect to the Haitian government. He was doing some kind of work for them. And we went to Haiti for quite some time, to Port-au-Prince.
Right.
And that was during the dictatorship of Baby Doc Duvalier.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, the secret police in Haiti, the Tutanmaku, dressed like Baron Samedi to scare people.
Mm-hmm.
Like they dressed like
Yeah.
Apalegba, with black sunglasses, black hat, and they were everywhere. And that impressed the hell out of me going there as a kid. And seeing, and you'd be in Haiti, you'd hear at night the voodoo drums in the hills not far away. The whole place was permeated with magic. And that had such a huge influence on me. And we, through the minister of tourism, who my father knew, we got to go to authentic voodoo ritual. And that's another thing. Actually, I was lucky enough to have parents who didn't suppress this kind of
Do you
thing
know,
right away.
I was going to wait a little longer, but I was going to say, I'm sitting here listening to you, and my childhood was remarkably similar. The only difference, and I was going to point this out, was my parents were devout Christians.
Ah,
And they instilled me with a sense of fear of hell and guilt at the very thought of dabbling in magic, even though the movie that really did it for me was The Devil Rides Out, which was a Hammer House of Horror. I saw that movie and I was like, okay, that's for me. That's what I got to do that. And when I was so young, a bit older than you, maybe 5, 6, and I've said this before too. I was sat in our little house in England between the living room and the kitchenette. And I suddenly thought to myself, actually, I'm not here. I'm plugged into some machine somewhere and I'm experiencing this reality. It's like there was no virtual reality back then because this was 60 something, but it was virtual reality. So I'm like, why am I in this virtual reality? And I saw this vision of like room after room after room of people hooked up to machines, living in this world through this virtual reality device. And so, like you, I was, constantly consuming mythology, legend. In my instance, not just Greek, but also Arthurian, Celtic.
me too.
Because of the English
My
connection.
father read
Yeah,
King Arthur with the Mallory version adapted for kids to me every night.
yeah.
That's the kind of stuff he read. So the
But the
Arthurian
guilt,
thing too. I haven't even gotten into the whole Holy Grail obsession. Yeah.
the guilt thing, which was not instilled deliberately by any means. It was just part of the ingraining of being a child in my family. It stopped me. It made me feel bad about, and it made me very careful and cautious about good and evil in that Christian perspective. So I never really dare until I became an adult really dabble in it. And you had the freedom, it seems, to kind of express and go off and do some stuff.
Right.
That's what it sounds like. Yeah.
Right. Well, and that is one's karma. I look back at my life now, and I'm working on a memoir, and I see that I was very fortunate to have the parents I had. They were, rather bohemian, sort of
Mm-hmm.
beatnik era. My father experimented with psychedelic drugs, and also they were actually quite belligerently against organized religion, like
Right.
priests or rabbis. If they came to my school, my father would protest, would argue, no, that should have no place in. He was open to spirituality, but very much against repressive,
Yeah.
organized religion, even to the point where, as I became more of a real practitioner, we would argue about it, that he thought I was becoming too dogmatic. Yeah, so seeing Haiti was a very much awakening experience, because it's like the ancient world where magic ruled everything, where the gods were all important.
Mm-hmm.
Very hard to understand that in 1972 America. But you go to Haiti, the gods are real, and I
Yeah.
saw possession. I saw that, yes, the gods, the Loas, enter people's bodies and they became possessed. And people talk casually about zombies as a real phenomenon. So that was a real awakening experience. And from that, I sort of turned more and more away from Western occultism and looked more into the real magical traditions of ancient peoples rather than the Crowleyan, Golden Dawnish, theist
Mm-hmm.
experiences that really were awakening experiences. And then also, we went to Mexico very often. And
Uh-huh.
my father was also interested in amateur archaeology. So I was steeped then in the Aztec and Mayan religion, and actually saw the temples and the ruins, and out in the jungles, the obscure temples, not the only the ones that you see as tourist attractions. And there was one in particular called El Castillo, the castle, that's in Tulum, which has now become infested with New Age idiots. It's a horrible place now, but it used to be a very pure spiritual power point, which is
Yeah.
why they became attracted to it. And I had a past life experience at
Uh-huh.
this Castillo, looking out at the Pacific Ocean, or the Gulf of Mexico. I had an experience of seeing a Spanish galleon materialize and then disappear. And I very much realized I was looking through the eyes of a Mayan priest or some
Right.
sort of religious practitioner at that. So I would say exposure to these ancient cultures, what lived of them firsthand, was very important. And then to get to your question, I resisted joining anything very much. I read all the Golden Dawn stuff. I read Olive Crowley. I read, you know,
Yeah.
Francis Barrett, everything that like as if that's the curriculum. But I was impressed immediately with the backbiting and the feuding and the
Yeah.
constant
Oh yeah.
battling.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Then, as you know, in my very early 20s, I moved to London to get away from the fundamentalist born again beginning of the satanic panic witch hunt in America, though I didn't even have a name for it yet, but I had a sense that that was not the place for me. As Ronald Reagan came
Yeah.
into power in 1981, I started to see the writing on the wall for an aspiring sorcerer. This was not the place to be. And stupidly went from the kettle to the pot, then went to Thatcher's England, where there were similar stuff going on. But that was very important in that England at that time was, and I've written about this in a magazine article, which will be coming out pretty soon. Um, England at that time was having a second magical revival. And for better or worse, chaos magic was very much in the air at that time. And I didn't like it, but it certainly meant everyone I met was somehow involved with serious pursuit of magic. And I got involved to a limited degree, again, through a woman, which is usually the doorway to me for all of my mystical
Yeah.
and magical awakenings. I met a woman at the Atlantis bookstore, which was the oldest occult bookstore in London, who was involved with the Typhonian OTO of Kenneth Grant, who was one of the, arguent successors to Aleister Crowley, and got involved with Typhonian OTO ideas of sex magic and all that, which I very quickly found were not accurate, were not historically valid. And I began researching at the British Museum. Actually, that inspired me to look at this is a bunch of nonsense. Kenneth Grant has just made up a bunch of, out of his own imagination,
Mhm.
filigreed with a little bit of fake scholarship, and this is misleading and wrong. So that actually led me to look into Egyptology on a deeper level to correct, in my mind, what seemed to be his errors. And then I started looking into the god Set, which became very important to me. And to the point where then I took a spiritual pilgrimage to Egypt and had an experience with Set at the tomb of Seti the First, the Setian pharaoh, which I've described at length elsewhere. So I won't go into too much detail, but that was an extremely formative experience. So in retrospect, going to Haiti, going to Mexico, going to Egypt, and contacting the real radiance and aura of cultures that were immersed in magic was incredibly important. More than any teacher or person,
Yeah.
contacting the gods directly. Um, and that was from my earliest childhood until the late 80s. I avoided organizations like the plague. However, I was working on a book called The Demonic Revolution, a book that I never published in 1987 and 1988 and 1989. And because of that book, I interviewed and met just about everyone who was then alive in the occult world. I should mention, too, in 1981 or 1980, no, it was 1983, sorry. I met Israel Regardie through a very odd synchronicity, and I saw that as a kind of confirmation, the way that it happened,
Hmm.
of magic's reality. And I've discussed that elsewhere too. But through this Demonic Revolution book, though I never published it, I interviewed just about everybody: the Alexandrian witchcraft, the OTO, the runic and Odinic revival, most of the leading Satanists. Richard Ramirez, I got to know him because of that book. And that opened the door to seeing what these occult organizations were like. And I had an extremely negative feeling about them because they seemed to be more concerned with human personalities and feuding between who is the
Oh
greatest
yeah.
Narcissus and who's the biggest dog in the occult world than any true wisdom. That became very apparent to me. You know, when I interviewed them, they'd be more concerned with defaming their
Yeah.
opponents, kind of like, you know, like the Bolsheviks arguing about minor points of communism. That's what it reminded me of, or right-wing groups that kill each other about some ideological difference. That,
Yeah.
like all extremist groups, they spend more time fighting with each other than with their enemies. So,
Yeah.
so that was an awakening experience as well.
It's interesting that you say that because, again, my route was once I sort of became a man and escaped and started to establish who I was as opposed to what I thought I was supposed to be. Growing up as, in a Christian English working class family, being the first to go to college, all this, I thought, you get married, you have kids, and blah blah. I decided, after spending most of my life plagued by poltergeist and ghosts and goodness knows what, and being absolutely filled with fear at this stuff, I decided I needed some kind of grounding. So I started exploring all of the organizations that seemed to me to be available, Amorc and people like this, and found them all fairly actually mundane and boring and not really useful.
Right.
But through that, I stumbled into a school called the Servants of the Light, ran by a lady called Dolores Ashcroft Nowicki out the Isle of Wight. And I did their first degree course, and it was a tremendous grounding. It was wonderful. It was Ernest Butler's original course, and it absolutely set me on the way. But whilst I was in that school, I mean, Dolores was obviously getting older, and you could see it was essentially a mass of people lining up to beat the other person into pulp so that they could take over from Dolores. It was a cult of the personality. And it wasn't at all what I'd expected of an organization of supposedly, enlightened people. So it kind of put me off. I did do some supervising work, and I did this. I was a second degree and all this kind of stuff. And then I fell out and left. And ever since then, I've done my own thing, and I'm much happier doing my own thing because I think, the pursuit of truth, you know what the truth is. You don't need anybody to tell you. Deep down inside, you already know the answers. You just have to find them.
Right.
And, I don't need a school in order to help me find them, but I did need a school to give me some disciplines.
Yeah, I agree with you well, I mean, I think I should add, without getting into too much detail, because it's such a complicated chapter. Then during the Satanic Panic, I mean, I had the same feeling as you, having looked. I mean, I went to OTO meetings, I went to Rosicrucian meetings, I went to the builders of the Aditum,
Yeah.
I went to the most obscure occult groups, and almost with a scientific rigor, the same way that I went through drugs and classical music. Like, okay, I will go from A to Z. I will examine these things and see if they're of any value. I found exactly what you described, how these are not enlightened people. It was always a personality cult around someone who may or may not have had some wisdom or knowledge, but then it deteriorated into office politics, basically, with occult trappings. And I found that revolting, and I still have absolutely no patience for that. So during the Satanic Panic, though, because then I formed my own organization, the Werewolf Order, and Radio Werewolf, my band, which I founded in 1984. And without realizing it, just being me, I offended so many people and touched so many nerves that I became a target unwillingly of the whole Satanic Panic witch hunt. And that, for better or for worse, forced me to find alliances within that world, because we were really being targeted by right-wing Christian fundamentalist, satanic, anti-satanic groups that thought any alternative religion or any kind of occultism was child sacrifice, or the usual nonsense. And so I sort of became allied for a time with Anton LaVey, who after a very brief period, I utterly rejected as a complete charlatan. And I will talk about in my forthcoming memoir why I completely rejected him and some of the things that were absolutely reprehensible. I fell in love with his daughter, Zeena, and who was then the high priestess of the Church of Satan. And she was a magical teacher to me. She was a very profound, and remains a very profound, magical practitioner. And again, she was an initiatrix to me that awakened a great deal of genuine left-hand path power and wisdom in the true sense of the word, as wisdom, Sophia, being a female quality. And then, to make a long story short, at the same time as I was deeply involved in real Satanism, I never agreed with LaVey about atheism. When I was a Satanist, I was like the devil rides out type.
Yeah.
That's why I differentiate and say that I was a devil worshiper, because that's what I did. I was not, an atheist thinking of it merely as a symbol, but I know that it is a real force. It exists. It is an actual being, and I haven't changed my mind about that, though I see it completely differently. And I've explained that in some of my lectures, which you can find on my YouTube channel, what my current understanding of the devil, the Satan, is. And then I got involved, after totally breaking with the Church of Satan, and then the experiences I had with the Werewolf Order, my own organization in America and Europe. After that, I made the biggest mistake I've made in my initiation, which was to join the Temple of Set. And that's the only organization of that type I ever actually joined. I was never a member of the Church of Satan, just an honorary member, because LaVey would, give out cards to people who he thought could be useful to him in the media.
Mm-hmm.
But the Temple of Set was the final nail in the coffin for me of Western occultism, because I found it to be completely corrupt, completely hypocritical, completely dedicated to a cult of personality, and devoid of any actual wisdom. And that led to a big battle, because Zeena became high priestess of the Temple of Set, and that led to a schism in which a huge amount of the Temple of Set quit to join her more authentic religious. I feel like I have had the opportunity to meet some of these people: Israel Regardie, LaVey, Aquino, Stephen Flowers, Don Webb, so that you don't have to. I can tell you why they have nothing to offer, and why they are, they are not sources of wisdom. They are what to quote René Guénon, and I do feel that I am to a certain extent, and I think that's an important point. Most of the things that the average person, if you start to look into occultism, you will find tainted sources that will mislead you and lead you into a dead end. You will not find the real truth merely by seeking. You will almost always end up being caught in, again, kind of like if you're feeling as a youth of being plugged into this machine, in a Gnostic sense, you get drawn into the demiurgic world if you don't have the training and understanding to see what is true and what is not true. Most of the things you're going to encounter are bullshit, and that
it's fascinating that you've been through that particular journey and come out of it with that sort of conclusion. So, I mean, I would never have dared to go into the dark side of occult back when I was younger, because it was just very I always saw the world very black and white, literally, like Harry Potter, good and bad,
Right.
And it's only been in the last few years that actually things have changed for me in that regard, that I now realise that's a bit stupid, and there's actually a lot to learn. And I told you, as we talked yesterday, about my experience with Marana, the Slavic goddess of death and winter. And I had a tremendous experience with that particular deity. And I've learned an awful lot from that. That's not negative. It's very positive. It's very set me on a different path altogether.
Right.
So where are you now then? What
Right.
what
Well,
are you doing now?
after, I mean, I'm giving a very condensed
Yeah,
version of my initiation. There's a lot more to it, but those are like some of the highlights and
yeah,
landmarks. Basically, uh, when I moved to Austria in 1990, and then at that point, the Werewolf Order looked very deeply into Guido von List, Karl Maria Willigut, into the whole Germanic esoteric world. And we really did very deep study into it. We went into the Ahnenerbe, and we found that too was a bunch of lunacy and self-invented nonsense. And for instance, I don't know if you know who Karl Maria Willigut was. He was Himmler's spiritual advisor for a
uh-huh.
while.
Mhm.
He was a lunatic who was literally in an insane asylum. We saw the Viennese insane asylum where he was locked up, and so that was like one of the final areas of Western esotericism that we looked into, and we found it too was just do it yourself, made up nonsense.
Hmm.
It's not worthy of respect. It's not historically grounded. So, and that was quite a long time ago. People still think of me as I was when I was 24 years old, but that was a hell of a long time ago. Um, so after the Temple of Set experience, after looking into the whole Germanic esoteric experience, ultimately I decided and I had a spiritual experience. Maybe I need to backtrack. When I was in London, I also became involved in Shaktiite Tantrism, which is the
Hmm.
worship of the feminine divine through Diva or Ishtara Diva. And in that case, I was initiated into a cult that worshiped Kali Ma. So at the same time as I was pursuing these other things, I was also pursuing this Shaktiite worship of Kali. And that is basically Tantrism
Hmm.
of the left-hand path, of the true left-hand path, which means the way of woman. It has got nothing to do with black magic, Satanism, etc. That's a misnomer, as I've also explained in several lectures. Um, Through that, and I began meditating. I should point out, and my interest in Eastern mysticism ran concurrently with this fascination with Greek and Nordic mythology. So I began meditating when I was 13 years old. And I believe that ultimately the practice of meditation blossomed as such that it became impossible to look at Western occultism as anything but a cesspool of illusions and nonsense. And I had these experiences that I saw, just how empty and hollow it was. So I pretty much decided that because of a spiritual experience with Kali that I had during a meditation, an actual appearance of Kali, she directed me to move from the Vedic Tantrism or Shaktism to Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism, which is, as you can see, my shrine behind me. I then became a Buddhist. I took the vows and converted to Buddhism, and eventually, with Changu Rinpoche, the late master, took the vows to Tantric Buddhism. So I am not only, fully converted and took the oath and refuge prayer dedication to Tantric Buddhism. It's not just,
Hmm.
some people say I'm a Buddhist. It means they read some books about Buddhism. I am a practicing Tantric Buddhist and a Tantric Buddhist teacher. And at the same time, I remain devoted to the God Set, which you can see on this side of my altar. So those are my two current and eternal spiritual streams. And also, as you will see in a book that is coming out soon about the god Abraxas, the Setian part of my spiritual life intersects with Gnosticism very much. There are many parallels, but then again, there are parallels with Tantric Buddhism and Gnosticism, which I think are looking at the same metaphysical issue from two different cultural perspectives.
Hmm. And throughout all this time, music has played a role in your magical life as well.
Oh yes, very, very significantly. In fact, it's been the main magical tool and tool of awakening that I've used. My first band, Radio Werewolf, or the one that brought me my notoriety in 1984 to 1993, Radio Werewolf was actually a public magical ritual, very much designed to bring ritual magic in a very, I must say, in a very reckless and irresponsible way. I performed public magical rituals
Right.
without telling people that that's what I was doing. And it
Right.
had all kinds of beneficial but also disastrous
Mm.
consequences. It was like the sorcerer's apprentice. But in my naive and frankly stupid and reckless 20s, I just thought, well, I will use music as a way of experimenting with public performance of ceremonial magic, which is what I did. And I've said before, it led to an atmosphere that was like an Altamont waiting to happen. That's what our concerts became like, and it was very powerful, but it was a very like wild and uncontrolled energy. I didn't really know what I was doing. I certainly evoked something, but it was like a Frankenstein's monster that got carried away with itself. And then I retreated from that and went deeper into myself in the mid 90s, I would say. And then the ultimate rejection of Western occultism, which is what my experience, which I'm grateful in a bizarre way to the Temple of Set for showing me how completely worthless it is, then made me think I have to only get involved in traditional religion that is passed on from one master to the other with a legitimate lineage, not somebody, having a book of the law appear Tuesday and then Wednesday they start their cult. So because of this experience with Kali, I eventually became a convert to Tantric Buddhism, which I do obviously believe is the truth and an actual method of liberation, which works, which effectively works, which is not based on theory, but practice. If you do it, it has the results that the Buddha promised. But before that, I looked into Sufism very seriously, which I would say is really one of the few other living lineage traditions that is valid. I ultimately rejected it because I cannot accept the Abrahamic religions, not any three of them at all, not in any way. I consider them the vehicle of the demiurge Yaldabaoth. It's, Yahweh, Allah, or Jehovah, however you want to look at it. I reject it from a Gnostic point of view. But I did look into Sufism for a while and found it did have genuine wisdom and power. But ultimately, I decided on Tantric Buddhism. So that is my current, main spiritual practice.
And back to the music, you've been doing some musical work recently?
Yes, music has been in my youth, there was an issue of Crawdaddy, a rock and roll magazine, came out in 1975. And I've written about this in an essay. William S. Burroughs was interviewing Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin. And he, I don't want to paraphrase it because I'll get the quote wrong. He basically very succinctly explained, Burroughs, in this interview, that the arts and that music can be the highest level of magic and of consciousness raising activity. And I already had started to feel that. I had always, looked at music as my main aspiration of my creative expression and had always been involved in music. But that particular interview really made me see it very clearly. And from then on, I looked at music as a spiritual practice and magical practice. And on my YouTube channel, you can find one of the many lectures I've given on sonic magic, which is something that I've made an in-depth study and practice of. And since for a while, I retreated from the musical world. And in 2014, returned to it and again, as I mentioned, my main driving force has been the goddess, the feminine wisdom, based on my magical motto, which is the ewige Weiblichkeit zieht mich hinan, from Goethe's Faust, the eternal feminine draws me onwards. The first concert I did when I returned to the musical world in 2014 was called In Her Thrall. And I did a performance in Dresden in which I performed cover versions of all of the female singers that most inspired me to become a singer myself. For instance, Nico, Debbie Harry, Marlena Dietrich, etc. So I re-began my musical career by doing a kind of ritual veneration of the female spirit. And since then, I've released several solo albums, and my most recent song, which is on my YouTube channel, just went up recently, is Destroy, She Said, which again is very much an evocation of the feminine, in this case in particular of the classic femme fatale. So yeah, music is so much a part of my life. It permeates, my everyday. That's my main focus. Also, I have written several books, and I'm continuing to make some films and moving more in that area. But all of those are radiations of my spiritual teaching. And I am also a teacher 3 days a week. I teach students, selected students around the world. But all of that activity is part of my magic, part of my teaching. It may seem secular, you may not hear in every song I've done why it's magical or why it has a mystical property to it, but everything I do has a magical purpose.
What I find interesting is that, again, it's when I talk to other people that are in the magical world, no matter how peripheral, and I ask them the questions that I ask in this podcast, I'm always astounded by the level of similarities of the path. I mean, the similarities and the differences, but there are some distinct similarities, and one of them is often music. And in my regard, I also make music for fun, nothing to do with magic, because I want to be creative. And I think we live in an era where we are being pushed to be more and more non-human, and I want to express my humanity. And I can express my humanity by being creative. And one way to be creative is to make music. But as an aside, on the dowsing work that I've been doing here in the Czech Republic, I came across a Templar church in a place called Jindřichův Hradec. And it has some artwork on the walls that comes from the 13th century and is said to be Templar in origin, or at least influenced. And there's a lot of those weird television shows over here about this artwork and how it hides the place to the location of the Templar treasure and all this kind of stuff. And I went to look at this, and I think I've deciphered some of it, not all of it, because I can't get up into the window arches real high up to see. But it has some grotesque figures as part of the artwork, and the rest of it is very floral, almost Steiner-esque, dying and living floral patterns. Mm-hmm. And what I discovered is that I think that the artwork actually says there are 4 frequencies hidden in this church. 2 of them I've established are 852 and 417 hertz, both solfeggio frequencies, both commonly associated with chakras. The grotesque image in the case indicates the chakra correctly for that frequency. The other 2 I have not yet found. But I've also discovered that when I go to a place like this, which is a Templar church built over a major earth energy center of power, a node, not only is the architecture built to accentuate the energy, but if you play those frequencies, it's like plugging into a 1,000,000-watt amplifier. So, music frequency plays a massive role in
absolutely. I can relate to that completely. The experience that I had at the tomb of Seti I in Egypt in 1983 with Set was a musical one. It was completely, he communicated to me through sound, which reverberated in, and I believe that the tombs and the temples of Egypt were built to acoustic standards, clearly. And even then, I experimented with singing in them and the echoing, and it's clearly meant for the invocations that the Egyptian priesthood did to reach certain frequencies. I've seen this, you mentioned the Templar connection. There is a Templar chapel in one of the castles of Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess, who also has a castle in your neck of the woods. But this one is in Austria. And we held a magical meeting there. And that chapel, too, is incredible. If you sing in it or make any sound in it, it's as if it's been mastered and mixed by George Martin on the spot. It's incredible. And another place like that is in Wewelsburg in the Valhalla, the castle that Himmler adopted and tried to make into his Germanic Vatican. That crypt of Valhalla, and I have done this, if you sing in there, it's incredible, the acoustics. So absolutely, it's, you know, how important is music to all spiritual traditions? To me, it is, you know, music is, because it is not a material phenomenon. We hear it, but you can't touch it. Unlike the other art forms, it's the doorway to the metaphysical, in that, you know, we make a sound, but the sound doesn't actually exist. It is neither here nor there. So it's in between the worlds, and therefore I think that's why it's the most powerful medium. And
Yeah.
I'm always a bit suspicious of magicians or mystics who don't have a feel or affinity for music. I think it's very important.
When you sort of have gone through all of these Western esoteric schools, traditions, and discounted them, did you find anything of value there?
Yeah, I mean, my emotional reaction is very little, but if I really try to be objective about it, there is a sincere desire on these people to find wisdom, to find actual gnosis. But ultimately, to reiterate what I said, I believe they are counter-initiatory. I think you have to judge it by with any teaching, you have to look at the fruits
Yeah.
of the tree. You know, and I would ask your listeners to look at the major streams of Western esotericism: the Golden Dawn, Crowley, Gurdjieff, Theosophy, etc. What has it led to in terms of true liberation? What has it led to in terms of true wisdom and knowledge? Or has it led to, as we discussed, this constant feuding of ego? It seems to me that Western occultism, even with good intentions, feeds the illusion of the ego. And that is a flaw in Western thinking, is this intense individualism to the point of narcissism and solipsism. I mean, in a Jungian sense, we should be individuated, but Western occultism seems to inflame the ego. And I'd say that is something I saw without fail in every single magical and occult group that I've monitored. And I think you agree, you've seen that as well.
Well, in a way, my own path, in its own way, is similar to yours, in the sense that I think probably where I've ended up is in sort of Slavic paganism, to be honest, which is a tradition that you know, goes back a long, long way. Unfortunately, nothing much written, so a lot of it is you know, some of it is made up recently, you know, obviously, and you have to be fairly discriminatory. But I just approach the deities as me in my own way, and I communicate with them, and basically I get what I get, and working with dowsing and earth magic, as I call it, has proven to be probably it's changed me in the last few years. I've changed beyond belief, I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, and it's just fundamentally changed the way I look at life, look at the world, look at people, everything. So I must have done something reasonable.
Well, I'm sure you agree that, I think, and this is something you know, so many complicated topics we're looking at today. Along with music, a connection to the wilderness and nature and the earth is of crucial importance to initiation. And, you know, most urban occultists are not really connected to the earth. To me, the ocean, the desert, the mountains, the forest, you know, I live out in the woods on the outskirts of Berlin, and the woods teaches me something every day. Forest, you know, teaches me, you know, and of course, current political ideologues will think, oh, that's tree hugging, and there's almost a hatred of nature in a lot of political ideology today, which I find very demiurgic.
Well, unfortunately, I think it's worse than that. I think that there's a push to remove the humanity from humanity in any which way possible, whether it's 15-minute cities or maybe you know, a lot of the so-called narratives seem to be against what I would call natural law, against nature, and it's like driving a bigger wedge between humankind and the planet. Even I mean, I'm writing a book at the moment, and last night I found myself writing about climate change and the CO2 thing. Even that is driving a wedge between humanity and the planet, because what it's saying is us, a carbon-based life form, has to persecute ourselves for being a carbon-based life form. You know, we have to watch our CO2 emissions as we breathe and speak, and And it begins to sort of, it all is driving in a direction for me of integration, man machine, artificial intelligence, trying
Yes,
to figure out
I
what
have to say,
consciousness is
yes,
and put
yeah,
it in a
I agree.
machine.
I'm completely against the whole transhuman
Yeah,
idea
absolutely.
in the scientific way.
Yeah,
Transhuman in the sense of theurgy, of ascending the human state
yeah,
to the divine state, of course, but
yeah, 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 yeah.
not this modernist transhuman idea. And of course, anything that we are also animals, and that's a big part of our
Yeah,
magical
absolutely.
connection. We are beasts
Yeah,
as well as humans, and we
yeah,
are everything. We are gods, we are demons, we have all
yeah,
6 realms of being within us, and we can create a balance between them.
exactly.
But becoming this machine, that absolutely is something that we have to oppose.
So I
And
reject anything that goes in that direction, and I think
absolutely,
the only antidote I know is nature and creativity and love, I suppose.
yes, I think we can all absolutely agree on that. And the thing about them is those 3 things are out of the control of the ego, actually. The
Hmm.
wilderness, you have to accept it. It is not made for you, and that
Hmm.
teaches you lessons. Love teaches you to transcend yourself and to care about another more than yourself, even. So that transcends the ego. And creativity, when you're really in the flow with music or writing or art, dance, film, you lose yourself in the process. So I think that is why those 3 are key to genuine initiation. And I think the final point, I wanted to mention when you said about your being drawn to Slavic paganism, is I've never been interested in human personalities. Like, I'm not interested in, for instance, my ex-wife and I looked deeply into Jack Parsons, and we interviewed everybody involved with that whole phenomenon. And ultimately what was important there is Babylon, Ishtar, Astarte, the goddess is important. The humans, that the mortal beings attracted to these things, never really fascinated me. And so I agree with you. If you're a beginner in this path, or even if you have some experience, I think we agree too, contact with the divine is the most important. Don't get involved in the politics
And
of some organization or
I don't
other.
know if it's a male thing, but contact with the divine female is important for me. And it's funny because I had a girlfriend that was working with me on dowsing up until about January, and we discovered that she could detect positive lines about a meter before I did, and I could detect negative lines about a meter before she did. And we
Mhm.
came to the conclusion that for the male, outer male, it's the recognition of the female as the opposite, and vice
Right.
versa. And this was being reflected in our ability, in our detection of a line. And so, to me, for a man who wants to grow and learn, I think divine female is where it's at. And I keep telling everybody, one day I'm going to go into the forest, I shall meet the goddess, and you'll never see me again.
Right. Well, that happens very often in Celtic mythology,
Yeah,
particularly. Men are drawn away from by a fey woman who
yeah,
draws them into a magical world, and they come back.
yeah.
Yes, that I agree. My whole life has been a series of initiations through the
Yes,
feminine divine, and I think we could end on the most controversial thing you could say in the 21st century, which you touched on, and the fact that it is controversial shows us what an insane world we live in. There is male and there is female. And these 2 polarities are existent things on a spiritual and physical level. And the balance between them that leads to the mystical experience and ultimately to
yes.
liberation itself, it is necessary to revere the masculine and the feminine as truly existing metaphysical forces. So in
And that's
this,
what I meant by natural law. One
right,
aspect of natural law that we seem to be working against increasingly, and I think will have dire consequences actually for people that do that.
it already is. If the human race can survive the mass idiocy and nonsense that we're going through, if it can survive, which is a question,
Yeah,
I think people will look at this period we're in as, like mass hallucination. Some like the
yeah,
world lost
yeah.
its sanity.
Marbles.
So, I mean, at the heart of the left hand path and of many spiritual traditions you can't revere the feminine if you don't believe that the feminine is an actual existent thing. You know,
Correct.
you can't balance the masculine with the feminine unless they are two different forces. They are not one force.
Yeah.
And this idea that there is no gender or millions of genders is actually utterly inimical to the spiritual tradition completely. And there, whether people like it or not, in this atheist anarchist world, as you say, there is natural law and there is metaphysical law. You know, it's like saying, I don't need oxygen. I don't believe in oxygen. So, you know, this is the kind of lunacy this is leading into. So I think this idea that you can create your own reality is can become dangerous and egotistical and lead to this kind of mass lunacy that we're experiencing. So I think, yeah, again, we can agree on ending. The feminine divine is worth venerating, is very crucial for all initiates, and you will find it as the hidden heart of every spiritual tradition, even the Abrahamic, you know,
Yes.
the Shekinah in Kabbalah, with the Holy Spirit is actually Sophia in Christianity.
Yeah.
I won't get into the forbidden verses in the Quran. I don't want a fatwa on me, but you know, we know underneath it all there is the feminine wisdom and the feminine divine. So it's very important, more than ever, for us to revere and venerate that power.
Nikolas, it's been really wonderful. If people want to know more about you, explore your music, or whatever, how do they find out more about you? How do they contact you?
Well, if they are locked to the internet, they can find me on my YouTube channel, Nikolas Schreck channel. I am forced to have Instagram, Facebook, and all the usual things. So I'm actually quite accessible through those three mediums, and I do teach people 3 times a week usually by word of mouth reference. But if people are interested, they can contact me through those 3 corporate mediums.
Sounds good. And once again, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure.
It was a pleasure to have the conversation, and I'm sure we will speak again.